from Illinois, and aside from being a constitutional law professor, really hadn't had a big boy job until that point. And it shows in his management skills. Before becoming president, the biggest thing he'd ever done is manage his own campaign, which had a staff of like 16 when he was running for Senate the first time. In that sort of environment, when you suddenly inherit the American government apparatus with a staff of several million, he was wildly out of his depth, and more important, he wasn't interested in the job once he got it. Being president means managing, and that means communicating with people. And while he was wildly intelligent, he didn't really care to be around others. So when he absorbed his briefs, he would read them. He rarely asked questions. He might submit questions to an agency for a written brief, but he really didn't interact with the people who put it together. So he built up his raw intelligence and his understanding of a situation in a way almost unparalleled in American history, but then nothing ever came of it. For 8 years, the United States effectively didn't have a foreign policy because he didn't want to speak with foreign leaders. He didn't want to speak with his congressional allies. He didn't want to speak with other people in the Democratic Party. He didn't want to speak with his own cabinet. And so for 8 years, we had one law that was basically passed in his tenure. That's Obamacare, and it wasn't even written by the White House. Congress put that together. The disconnect between Obama and the government is directly responsible for the disenchantment that a lot of Americans feel with government in general. And that led directly to the rise of the next guy. So if you're looking for someone to blame for the rise of Donald Trump, you don't have to look any further than Barack Obama, because that disconnect is ultimately what broke trust in government, the fact that we didn't engage for 8 years. And so, of course, now we have to turn to the guy who came in next. Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from DC once again with the next installment of our leadership series on world leaders of the present and recent past. Obviously have the Capitol here behind me, which is, I've been coming in and out of DC for 25 years now. It's always under construction, which I think says something about U.S. government, and the food trucks in front of it are more reliable for food service than anything that's inside, which I think is equally good for a backdrop for the president we're going to talk about now, which is Donald Trump. I think the best way to understand Trump is to compare him to his immediate predecessor, who is by far the most similar American president to Trump. In all the ways that matter, they were identical, and in all the ways that matter, they were absolutely opposite, and that kind of shaped who he is. So, for example, Barack Obama didn't run really as a Democrat. He was an outside candidate who came with his own political support and ran on charisma rather than policy. Sound familiar? But whereas Obama then shunned the party when he got into the presidency and wouldn't talk to anyone, Donald Trump embraced the party and took it over and systematically kicked out factions that he found problematic, like, say, national security, fiscal, and business conservatives. He remade the party in his own image. As to policy, Donald Trump was almost identical in many ways, but also the inverse. So Obama was super brainy, and he felt he needed to understand the ins and outs of everything that was happening in the world, and he really did understand. But since he didn't like meeting with people, policy never came out of it. We had basically 8 years of nothing. Donald Trump was going to have a policy, and he loved the limelight. He loved being with people, but a little bit like Obama, he didn't really care what they had to say. So most meetings were about him talking about him, and policy would come out as a tweet, and he just assumed that the government would take it and run, and that's not how management works. So we had policies, they were loud, they were brash, they were bold, and they were never implemented because the president was moving on to the next thing. It didn't matter if this was domestic or foreign policy. So government by speech, government by tweet, again, inverse of Obama. There was no follow-up whatsoever, but it was loud and it was ever present. Now, I attempt in my work to be apolitical because nobody hires me to find out what I think about domestic politics or where I think the world should go. They care about where it is going, regardless of whether I like it or not, regardless of whether they like it or not. And so I tend to give politicians a lot of rope to hang themselves before I make a judgment. With W. Bush, I didn't really give up hope until year 7, when the surge happened in Iraq and it became apparent that the national security community had been so locked into the war for so long, and the administration was so tired and just lost all creativity that it was apparent that nothing good was going to happen with the remainder of the term. With Barack Obama, I lost faith immediately after the re-election when it became apparent that this hands-off, non-management style wasn't just until he was beyond the next election, that this really was the president and we were never going to get any policy ever. Donald Trump and I probably started to part ways a little earlier. In the second year, he started actively campaigning publicly against institutions in the U.S. government that were designed to do nothing but support the president. And treating groups like the CIA as your enemy when all they're trying to do is inform you and help you get things done seemed a little self-destructive to me. And then, of course, about 3.5 years in, he started actively agitating against his own government, against his own cabinet even. And then, of course, with the elections, his appointed election comptroller declared the elections the cleanest ones that have ever happened in the United States. But, of course, Donald Trump had already made another decision. So, in my opinion, that condemns Donald Trump to being right down there with Barack Obama as one of the bottom 10% of presidents in American history. Yeah, I'm going to get a lot of hate mail from that from everyone. All right, next up, the guy in charge right now, Joe Biden. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you for one final video from Washington, D.C. Got the White House behind me, so guess who we're going to talk about? The guy who actually lives there now, Joe Biden. Now, commenting on a sitting president is always dangerous because no matter what I say, I'm going to piss everybody off. So let's just get to it, knowing that that is where this is going to go. In terms of previous experience, the only president that we have ever had that is kind of in the same league as Biden for actually having a real grown-up job is Barack Obama. Sometime around the fall of Rome, Biden was a legal clerk for about 1.5 years, and he hasn't had a real job since. He has been in the Senate since about the time of the Crusades, and so he's seen a lot, but he hasn't really done much of anything except for sit on meetings. Now, the negatives of this are obvious. He's guided more by ideology than most presidents because he really doesn't have a lot of real-world experience. On the flip side, dude knows how to run a meeting. And when you bring that attitude, that sort of, for lack of a better word, wisdom into a room, it means you realize that you're not going to know everything. And so you're okay with asking questions. You're okay with showing your belly a little bit. And that means, unlike Donald Trump or Barack Obama, Biden is the most engaged president that we've had in, 13, 14 years. You can even make the argument that when it comes to shaping a policy, he's even better than Clinton or W. He's only 2 years in. I'm not willing to say that he's better or worse than W or Clinton. I think the jury's still out, but he's clearly better than Obama or Trump simply because he's willing to use the information that's provided and the tools of state. Now, that doesn't mean that I or anyone have to agree with him. I'm simply talking about managerial competence at this point. And in fact, in economic policy, say what you will about Trump. He had a number of people on his cabinet, especially in the first year, that really knew their way around. And say what you will about W, he had some serious leading lights and intellectual heavyweights. Clinton was able to pick people and throw them at problems fairly effectively. And even Obama, while his cabinet was highly ideological and had very little real-world experience, they were all clever people who understand that if you wanted to get something done, you have to use actually the tools of state. Biden's superior to all of them in that regard, in that he understands and trusts in the power of government, but his cabinet is not all that. He really doesn't have anyone on the cabinet who I would consider a leading light in the space that they're supposed to be regulating. But that is not just a negative. There is a positive to that, because there is an understanding throughout his cabinet, taking cues from a boss who doesn't claim to know everything. And for the first time since at least the W administration, cabinet ministers are actually reaching out to industry to ask questions. And that degree of humility is something that I think will bode well for what comes for the next 2 years. That said, I can't say I'm overly impressed with economic policy. I'd probably give that a solid D. Biden is setting us up for a lot of problems that we're going to pay for over the course of the next 50 years. That's a different topic. But on security policy specifically, the fact that Biden was there when the pyramids were built means that he understands what's going on in the world and the broader context of it. So when he sees the Russians carrying out policies that we have not seen for a very long time, he understands exactly where that leads. And so security policy vis-a-vis the Russians and Ukraine and NATO, I kind of give him a B for most of that. Now, security policy is a narrow subset of foreign policy where I am less impressed, which is a narrow subset of all the policies that the president is ultimately responsible for. So I do see some hope. I'm not willing to write off Biden like I have the last 4 at this point. There are reasons to be optimistic, but I think the single biggest one is having a president that doesn't think that he knows everything, and so asks and tries to learn from everybody. I'm going to call that a win. All right, that's it from me.